right. Good evening. Welcome everyone to the Spring 2023 Karpat Lecture in Turkish Studies. I'm Dan Stolz. I'm the Karpat Assistant Professor in History. Please bear with me, I have a few introductory remarks to make before I have the pleasure of introducing our distinguished guest tonight. First, we do appreciate if everyone could sign in on the sheet at the front of the room here. Maybe we could pass it around during the talk. It's helpful if we know how many people attend our events. You can sign up for our email list to find out about future events. And for my students, it's how I know you're here and I can give you credit for our class. I do want to say as well, we appreciate everyone's flexibility in making it here this evening. This event, as you may recall, was originally scheduled for February. We had that blizzard come through and we had to postpone. It was not our intention to have this event late in the day during Ramadan. I know it's not ideal for some folks, but we're very fortunate we were still able to have the event, and we appreciate everyone being here. On a more somber note, I want to acknowledge we're here to talk about Turkish history, and this is a time still of deep grief in Turkey. The February earthquakes took over 40,000 lives across Turkey and Syria, devastated many cities, and resulted as well in the loss of irreplaceable cultural heritage. The scale of the loss is really difficult to comprehend and is really only just becoming clear. I think it's appropriate tonight to acknowledge the efforts of the Madison Association of Turkish Students, who have really done a lot to support those who are affected, both in the region and here on campus. So, Kemal H. Karpat served the University of Wisconsin-Madison for 35 years as a professor of history. And during that time, he was a pioneer in the study of both late Ottoman and Turkish Republican history. And I say he was a pioneer both in his research, which ranged from the study of ideology to urban history, but also in his institutional program building roles. He was a founder of the Middle East Studies Association, a founding president of the Central Asian Studies Association, founder and longtime editor of the International Journal of Turkish Studies. Professor Karpat also founded a Center for Turkish Studies here at UW-Madison in the Department of History, and he very generously endowed that center through a bequest several years ago. Professor Karpat would have been 100 years old last month, so now I think is an auspicious time for us, in a sense, to relaunch the Center for Turkish Studies with tonight's Karpat Lecture. And I'd like to thank Dr. Deniz Balgamesh for all her efforts on behalf of the Center and for her efforts organizing tonight's event in particular. I also want to thank the History Department staff, especially Bri Oramus, for all of her assistance. 2023 is also a meaningful year in the history of the Turkish Republic, which will mark its centenary in October. So we had a Turkish Studies meeting here on campus, and we had a challenge. Who could we invite to give a talk that would both commemorate the legacy of Kemal Karpat and help us reflect on 100 years of Turkish history? It was actually a very short conversation. It did not take us very long at all to settle on our guest tonight. I'm really pleased that he was able to accept our invitation. It's really an honor to introduce Professor Rashad Kasaba of the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. Trained as a sociologist, Professor Kasaba has done some of the most generative work across multiple fields of Turkish history in the last 30 years. His research has ranged across topics including migration, identity, and urban space. Among his many published works, I'll mention only a few. He is the author of a volume called A Movable Empire, Ottoman Nomads, Migrants, and Refugees from 2010, a deceptively slim volume, which I think certainly pound for pound is one of the most insightful things I've ever read about Ottoman society. He is the editor of the Cambridge History of Turkey and the Modern World from 2008. He also co-edited Rethinking Modernity and National Identity in Turkey from 1997. Professor Kasaba served for a decade as the director of the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington, and really helped to make the University of Washington one of the leading programs in Ottoman and Turkish studies in North America for a long time now. I won't take any more of his time away from you. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rashad Kasaba back to the University of Wisconsin.
This was working, but okay, very good. So thank you very much, Daniel. This is really a very pleasant trip for me. I'm very glad that I was able to make it after the snowstorm last month. And it has at least two kind of special meanings for me also. I was here about 10 years ago. I think some people who are in the audience, I met them then. But actually my first trip to University of Wisconsin, Madison was a lot longer. Before that, in the early 1980s, Professor Karpat invited me along with my mentor to give a talk here as part of a conference. And that was my first, I was still a graduate student then, that was my first professional presentation of my work in front of my, not peers actually, my mentors and senior scholars, and I was terrified. But it is always something I will never forget, for better or worse. So Wisconsin has a very good memory for me like that. Also, some of you may know that actually Professor Karpat started his graduate work at the University of Washington, the other UW, where he received a master's in political science, and his master's thesis had nothing to do with Turkey. It was about syndicalism. And I was able to get a copy of that also, and it is really interesting. It's 1950, so that's another tie I have to Kemal Karpat and the university here. And of course, beyond that, his work has been an incredible source of inspiration for the generations that came after that, including mine. So, Turkey started its Republican history in 1923 as a peasant society. Then all but 20% of its population lived in places with less than 2,000 people. Most of these settlements were dispersed across Anatolia with little to no regular means of communication or transportation. The country's culture and politics were dominated by a thin layer of urban elite whose attitude towards the rural majority was a mixture of embarrassment, paternalism, apprehension, and sometimes fear. Urban centers in 1923 dominated this train, but they had also lost a lot of their earlier glory. They had lost almost all of their Greek, Armenian, and Levantine population, which meant that they had also lost most of their manufacturing bases and commercial and other connections to the outside world. Now, Turkey of 2023 has little in common with that country. Today, the country's economy is dominated by growing industrial and service sectors. The shares of urban and rural population are the exact opposite of what they were in the 1920s, as you can see in this graph. Today, barely 20% of Turkey's population still live in places that can be described as rural. The vast chasm that had cast 80% of the country into poverty and isolation in earlier decades has all but disappeared. Nowadays, as those of you who are familiar with the country know, any settlement, no matter how remote or small, can be reached easily from any part of Turkey through a combination of land and air travel. Digital technologies have greatly improved communication making all of Turkey part of a national network. Looking at this macro picture, one may be inclined to conclude that the hopeful visions of early leaders and the optimistic prognostications of modernization theorists have in fact been realized, and Turkey has become a shining example of successful development and modernization. The story, however, is more complicated. The stark separation between urban and rural parts of Turkey in the 1920s was a legacy of the Ottoman past. It was not just due to distance or to limited transportation and communication networks or linguistic barriers. The inequality between rural and urban parts of the empire was the result of the economic and administrative system of the Ottoman state. That state, of course, was dominated by an urban elite, and their power and privilege derived from the toil of the peasants and farmers. The Turkish state inherited and preserved the main contours of this structure in its early years. Once the wars were over and the republic was established, the leaders knew well that the reconstruction of the country would depend on the labor of rural Turkey. A phrase that is attributed to Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, "Köylü milletin efendisidir," peasant is the master of the nation, quickly became one of the early mantras of the Republic, and has been cited ever since as a proof of his respect for peasants. In practice, the outreach to peasants, how to integrate them into this national project, proved to be complicated. First, there was something called the People's Houses. These were established in 1931, and they were conceived as cultural outposts that would build connections to the provinces and villages. People would learn to be modern Turkish nationals by attending various classes and programs at these places. The People's Houses actually ended up revealing the distance that separated the nation's center from the periphery. The assumption that people could be taught to be modern according to some standards that were conceived elsewhere caused a lot of resentment. And in some ways, People's Houses ended up widening the gap between the urban and rural parts of the country. And this is a point Kemal Karpat makes as well. And as you can see, in addition to classes and meetings in these buildings, they also taught peasants how to ski and some other things that were thought to be part of this sort of the modern vision of a new country. People's Houses were followed by the village institutes. And these were founded in 1940, and the purpose of these was to give peasants practical education and turn them into productive workers. There is a literature that extols the idealism that was behind this experiment and the long-term benefits of the education the poor peasants received in them. There is another interpretation that sees this enterprise as an effort to keep the peasant youth in their villages, live, work, and learn in their buildings that they were required to build themselves so that they could contribute to this national reconstruction. It is true that some of the graduates of these institutions went on to have distinguished careers, both sometimes as bureaucrats, as intellectual leaders, politicians, but the impact of the institutes themselves was somewhat limited. There were about 21 of them established all across the country, and they existed for a little over 10 years, and then they were shut down in the 1950s. But then again, you see the construction on the top left, farming on the bottom, learning to play the mandolin there, and then the classes for teaching, learning, reading and writing. So policies of a centralized bureaucracy and education, like the examples of which we saw, and eventually the completion of a national network of land and air transportation, and the building of an all-encompassing communication system, all of these contributed in fundamental ways to Turkey's national integration eventually in the 20th century. But the key and the most important factor in this process was the rural-urban migration. This started really in earnest in 1950s and has continued ever since. Istanbul, whose population was barely 1 million in the 1950s, has over 16 million people today. To put it another way, there are more people in Istanbul today than there were in all of Turkey in 1923. Rural migrants who flowed into cities like Istanbul in the second half of the 20th century overwhelmed the fledgling modernity of the Republic and gave it a more complex and diverse content. And of course, the important thing here is the planned initiatives like the institutes and the people's houses and all those really fell by the wayside as a result of this massive flow of people from rural to urban areas. And this shows you the growth of the city. Those of your family will recognize the difference between 1915 and 2000, 21st century. And this is a satellite picture of how large the city is now today. Somewhere here, just about the old city, and it just grows. Now, the rural-urban migration that started in 1950s bridged the vast chasm that had separated the urban and rural life and changed Turkey fundamentally and irrevocably. The dynamics and consequences of this massive movement of population is key to understanding the first 100 years of Turkish Republic. From politics to economy, to culture, to music, to movies, to lifestyles, all aspects of today's Turkey have been deeply influenced and even shaped by rural-urban migration. In discussing this phenomena in the 20th and 21st century, I'm going to take two books as my guides, and hence the title of my talk. These are Professor Kemal Karpat's The Gecekondu, Rural Migration and Urbanization, which was published in 1976, and the other is Orhan Pamuk's novel, Estrangers in My Mind, which was published in 2015. As we all know, Kemal Karpat was one of a group of social scientists who studied social change in Turkey by utilizing methodologies of anthropology, sociology, political science, as well as history. And many of these methods were developed in the West in the 1960s and 1970s. There's a very distinguished group of social scientists, most of them are from Turkey, who did this kind of work. The research which the Gecekondu is based on is, however, one of the earliest attempts to provide a comprehensive account of the dynamics that shaped the first major wave of rural-urban migration in Turkey. So there were researchers about cities, there was researchers about villages, but the migration itself became the subject, was the subject of the Gecekondu, and that is one of the first comprehensive attempts at that for that period. Almost 50 years after its publication, the Gecekondu still stands out with its rigorous methodology, broad scope, and the prescient observations. The book focuses on 3 settlements on the northern hills of Istanbul, roughly around here. The research that is based that is the basis of the book was conducted in the late 60s and the 70s. It includes a detailed study of these communities, as well as the places in Anatolia where they came from. In ethnographic parts of the book, Karpat asks many questions about this early phase of rural-urban migration. They include what pushed the migrants out of their villages, what pulled them into these specific neighborhoods in Istanbul, their ethnicity, religion, average age, gender, marital status, as well as their thoughts about urban society, urban culture, and politics. Karpat also describes what the migrants' first homes were like. He has information about the price of properties where these people lived, their typical occupations, their wages, employment conditions, and political preferences. Barely 2 decades into the first wave of rural-urban migration, Karpat's findings make it clear that the face of Istanbul and Turkey was changing in fundamental ways and forever. Gecekondu contains several important observations. And these are very important not only for understanding those communities, but the broader impact of this migration on Turkey. The most important of these is the role played by the availability of land in the creation and expansion of the migrant settlements in Istanbul and other metropoles. Along with many of the laws and institutions of the Ottoman Empire, the Republican state inherited ownership of large tracts of land from its Ottoman predecessor. These included the significant amount of land and properties that had been part of the royal household foundations, and also the properties that had belonged to Greek and Armenian families. In addition to the newly developing industries in the 1950s, the availability of these lands acted as a magnet for the people who were embarking on their journey to Istanbul. The new arrivals either occupied these lots outright or purchased them for a token from people whose claim to ownership was suspect at best. They then built ramshackle houses on them by using whatever material that was readily available. The term gecekondu, meaning perched, the term gecekondu, meaning perched or put up or built overnight, was invented by the long-term residents of the city to describe the fast growth of these settlements. Such purchases, notwithstanding, the exact status of these lands always remained in doubt, leaving the people who had built on them perpetually in a precarious position. Those who built the first houses acquired a degree of control over further access to adjacent areas, turning them into nascent landlords and putting them in a powerful position in relation to those who arrived in the following years. Often, and this is interesting, these new landlords were either related to or were the very same people as those who had lorded over the peasants in the villages. In other words, and this is again from Karpat, you have a situation where he describes it as köy ağası, şehir ağası oldu. So people who were landlords in the villages now became landlords in the cities. And I have a cartoon here from a famous Turkish artist, Turhan Selçuk, which kind of describes this. On the left hand you have the landlord, the rural, and then the right is the landlord in the city, or the lord of the city. And this is important because the inequalities in this way that existed in rural areas in a way were carried over into the cities, and they continued in the cities as well. As hundreds of thousands of people made their way into Istanbul and to other metropoles and found ways of grafting themselves onto the urban fabric, the reaction of the residents of the city, who had insulated themselves for generations, was a deep resentment and even contempt. In 1974, Burhan Felek, who was a well-regarded newspaper columnist of the old school, lamented that he no longer recognized anyone during his daily walks in Üsküdar. We are spread and lost just like the beads of a necklace with a broken string, he wrote. And Doğan Kuban, an urban historian, thought that taxi drivers, most of them were new immigrants, were driving their cars just like they used to ride their horses in the villages. Starting from a relatively limited number of neighborhoods that Karpat studied, the Gecekondu areas became entrenched and expanded, encircling Istanbul and also other cities in Turkey. This growth can be described as organic, meaning that it lacked planning and was not undergirded with infrastructure or basic services. In time, services were provided, but also in an unplanned and haphazard way. These photographs show on the left people getting water from a tanker that would bring water to them. On the bottom left, you have an older photograph. People are carrying, again, water and resources. And this is sort of what the houses look like. Electricity eventually came, but it came in an haphazard way. For example, they would be stolen with illegal extensions and then incorporated into the grid through periodic amnesties as a way of securing political support in these neighborhoods. Initially, Gecekondu neighborhoods had been regarded primarily as reservoirs of labor. Therefore, early roads that were paved to transport the Gecekondu population to their places of employment came only to the edge of these neighborhoods and extended only later into the interior, gradually, and again, not as part of a plan. Now, despite these difficulties, Karpat's informants told them that they had no intention of going back to their villages. As such, they were different from the circulating workers and nomads that I wrote about and that had been prevalent in the Ottoman Empire. The new migrants were determined to succeed, and they displayed a high degree of optimism and, according to Karpat, a spirit of entrepreneurship. Now, that they regarded their relocation as final, however, did not mean that they severed all of their ties to their villages. They went back for occasional visits, they sent money to relatives who were left behind, arranged marriages in the villages, and brought staples back to Istanbul. These ongoing links to the village served as a source of support and strength for the migrants as they made their lives in Istanbul. Just like the peasants, who were left to their own devices during most of the Ottoman and Turkish history, these migrants were also bereft of any meaningful institutional or other protection. So they had to rely on their own networks, on their relationships, on their own resourcefulness to succeed. Karpat describes the result of this process as something more than the fusion of folk culture into the urban one. He describes it as the emergence of a new synthesis, which he describes as the new national culture. To reflect on the lives of migrants in the decades that followed Karpat's research, I will use Orhan Pamuk's A Strangest in My Mind as a guide. Although fictional, this book is based on Pamuk's lifelong observations of the city where he grew up in the second half of the 20th century. In A Strangers in My Mind, Pamuk gives us an opportunity to watch how Istanbul grew from the perspective of those who came from other parts of Turkey after the 1950s, and how these migrants shaped the city in the rest of the 20th and the 21st centuries. The main character of the novel is Mevlüt. Now, these drawings are by Orhan Pamuk himself, and they're actually very interesting. I'll have one more later on. I just thought I would put him up there. Mevlüt, who along with his father arrives in Istanbul in the early 1960s and finds his niche through the networks of relatives who made the journey in preceding years. Mevlüt and his father is an itinerant peddler who sells a fermented drink called boza, and occasionally other food on the streets. By following Mevlüt as he walks the streets of Istanbul carrying boza containers on his shoulders, and the one on the right is the Turkish edition of the book, but the photograph is by Ara Güler, and Pamuk's imagination, Mevlüt carries boza on that kind of contraption, and which was very common in Istanbul streets, especially in earlier decades. So by following Mevlüt, Pamuk provides us with an unusually close look at the city and an appreciation of how Mevlüt reacts to the whirlwind of change that surrounds him. Mevlüt represents the ultimate result of the process of optimization that started with the first settlers Karpat interviewed. His story gives us a sense of how migrants navigated the fast-changing city in the second half of the 20th century. As was the case with the Gecekondu, the period that Karpat was talking about, access to land plays a central role in the story of Mevlüt and his family. Over the years, the two-room dirt floor shack that gave Mevlüt and his father a foothold in Istanbul becomes a permanent home with the deeds that are distributed by politicians. In the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, Istanbul expanded in all directions. These early settlements and those where Karpat had done his research were now surrounded by expensive new developments. As a result, the original Gecekondu districts, including Pamuk's fictional neighborhood, become prized real estates in Istanbul, leading to intense struggles over them. So we have actually the earlier settlements are here, and the new ones keep growing, and then around them now, as those of you who know Istanbul, are some of the most expensive neighborhoods, and there's that kind of struggle between those two settlements. So in the late 1970s, coming close to 1980s now, is an important turning point. It's the time when the industrialization model that had been followed by the Turkish state since the late 1920s started to become unsustainable. There were neither enough new industries nor housing for the millions who continued to make their way to Istanbul and to other metropoles. As a result, many of these people ended up in occupations like Mevlüt or in informal sectors of the economy. They ended up providing services to the urban population, services like transportation and other kinds of support services. And those are, again, just like the networks that they were taking advantage of, these are, again, based on their own resourcefulness, innovation, and filling in the gaps that existed in the urban network. In 1979 and 1980, Turkey responded to these economic pressures by adopting a sweeping program of economic liberalization. Most of this shift from a closed national economy to a program of export promotion was carried out under a military regime in Turkey. There was no space for labor unions, professional associations, and civil society organizations to provide input or exert pressure on the state. As a result, an atmosphere of unregulated and unruly capitalism developed in Turkey. Land speculation in Istanbul, including in those old Gecekondu districts, became rampant, absorbing much of the new capital that was flowing into the country under the new economic policies. The new era also witnessed the devolution of power to the local municipalities. Now, this was not necessarily a bad thing in itself. It used to be the government kind of oversaw all the municipalities in Turkey. But it was also carried out without any safeguards. And it opened up, at the end of the day, new opportunities for abuse, corruption, and cronyism. These were the years when the seeds of Turkey's mammoth construction industry were planted. This sector would eventually become linked to a handful of businessmen who in turn will become very close to the government and especially to the President Erdogan. Massive construction projects dominated Turkey's economic growth after the turn of the new century, making Turkey's economic model unstable and susceptible to external shocks in the long run. Export-promoting policies of the 1980s opened up new areas of production and employment. Some of these were actually in the Gecekondu districts, where women were employed in textile workshops and they manufactured things for export. But these did not grow fast enough to alleviate the problems of unemployment and poverty in these places. One of the celebrated novellas of the period is Latife Tekin's Berci Kristin Çöp Masalları, Tales from the Garbage Hills. This describes the explosion of a garbage dump in one of these neighborhoods that was the result of overcrowding and lack of proper infrastructure. This is an event that actually happened on April 28, 1993, in Ümraniye, which is one of the Gecekondu districts in the Anatolian side of Istanbul. And these are the newspaper clippings from that day. The upper left is the garbage disaster. The one says couldn't find either his wife, his house, or his children. And the last two show the cleaning efforts after the explosion. You can imagine, I mean, it was this compact kind of gas all of a sudden blew up. Now, eventually, in this time, we also see the Turkish state moving in and intervening to uproot the settlers in especially the earlier Gecekondu districts by force and reclaim the land, and land that originally belonged to the state anyways. In return, the residents were promised units with favorable loans in the high rises that were planned in other parts of the city. Here we have, again, from those days, the buildings being torn down, people being dragged out of their homes, and there were, because these communities had been there for such a long time now, they also had quite a bit of solidarity and organizations, and there was really a lot of resistance to these intrusions, but at the end of the day, of course, the state succeeded. The important thing about this is that this is time also when the government came into this equation in a forceful way as the main planner, enforcer, the broker of deals for the new constructions, and a new actor, a new powerful actor, acted in collaboration with contractors, with these people who eventually became these huge, very rich construction magnates. Now the problem was that many of these new buildings, the modern buildings, were built away from the city center and at a distance from where the jobs were. As a result, people not only were forced to move, but they were cut off from their networks of support and were often left vulnerable, without a job, and in debt. And here shows the slide shows some of the new buildings, as you can see at the bottom, and the old ones that were being torn down, which is next to a huge stadium being built there. In As Strangers in My Mind, we follow some of these big changes from Mevlüt's vantage point. For example, Hacı Hamit Vural, who was already a wealthy man in Mevlüt's village, takes advantage of the fast-changing environment, collaborates with the government agencies, and acquires multiple lots and builds luxury residences on them. By the end of the novel, Vural is a construction magnate who owns big apartment blocks and shopping malls. They are very wealthy, the family, but they are still part of the networks that provide a degree of protection and security to people like Mevlüt. Ultimately, it is through these networks that Mevlüt and the members of his extended family become owners of their own flats, which is the ultimate sign of making it in the city. As Mevlüt glides through these tumultuous years, he faces his share of adversities. He first falls in love with a woman, but he is tricked into marrying her sister. Then both his father and his wife die unexpectedly, leaving him to raise his two daughters on his own. He suffers the harassment of the municipal authorities and is almost cheated out of his share of the apartment units by his cousins. Throughout this period, violence is all around Mevlüt, but we never see him take part in any of these conflicts or resist in any way to the injustices he faces. The only exception to this is when, on the insistence of his second wife, he refuses to go along with the demands of his cousins and insists on his rightful share of the new apartments. Otherwise, Mevlüt appears to be a passive observer of his own life and destiny. He walks the streets of Istanbul, always maintains a distance between himself and the people who buy his boza, and stays out of trouble most of the time. And this is, again, a drawing by Orhan Pamuk. I find this interesting because he puts him on top of this tall building. Almost he's like on top of the world, and nothing that happens around them can affect him in any way. Mevlüt's story is one of personal perseverance. He enters the city in the most marginal way imaginable and manages to cling on, spreads roots, and survives. With the money he earns by selling boza, he pays for his daughter's education, which was a deeply held aspiration of Karpats respondents and has been true for all migrants ever since. Mevlüt remarries after his wife dies, this time to the woman who had fallen in love in the first place, and throughout continues to sell his boza in the streets, which, to him, as close to therapy as can be imagined. Pamuk writes that when Mevlüt is out strolling, he forgets the strangers in his mind. He gets to know and identifies with Istanbul so closely that he imagines quote, someone out there was working to improve the city for his benefit. At some point toward the end of the novel, when he looks at the shimmering windows of the high rises that surround him, he assumes that they are speaking to him and telling him the story of the city, which is also his story. Quote, Istanbul was dreadful and dazzling at once. It could still make him flinch, but even now, at 55 years of age, he still felt the urge to leap right into the forest of staring buildings. Mevlüt's life represents the fulfillment of the dreams and aspirations of the early migrants whom Karpat interviewed. Those new residents of the Gecekondu districts made it clear to him that they had no intention of going back. They wanted their children to get an education, and they wanted a secure life in Istanbul, for which they do all they could to actually own the land. All things that Mevlüt accomplishes. Orhan Pamuk constructs Mevlüt's story so that it does not become one of victimization. Nevertheless, this story should not be seen as the culmination of Turkey's successful modernization in the way that this was prophesied by early generation of social scientists. And I should say, actually, even though he is in some ways part of that generation, Karpat had a lot of insights, and in the Gecekondu he is very aware of the underlying problems and the direction of the changes in society, and he never comes across as this really starry-eyed modernization theorist. Contrary to the expectations of those writers, Mevlüt is not likely to be ever fully assimilated to his city. Even though the millions of people who moved to Istanbul and other cities in the 20th century changed the face of the city and modern Turkey forever, they never managed to upend the power structure that always kept them at the margins. Now, between the time of Karpat's research and Pamuk's novel, the gatekeepers who control access to power and wealth in Turkey have also changed. They are no longer the military or bureaucratic elite who established the republic and their descendants. Now, a newly wealthy class of entrepreneurs and merchants who have originated from the provinces control the levers. And their worldview is shaped by Islam and conservative values rather than the secular ideals of enlightenment and modernization. One of the first constructions of Hacı Hamid Vural in the old Gecekondu district is a massive mosque, not unlike the one you can see here. Like a good modern subject, Mevlüt tries to blend in and disappear in the city's anonymity, but he is never free from the weight of being looked down upon, being kept waiting at the doors of the apartment buildings by kapıcıs, and harassed by the state. Pamuk describes this as not quite managing to get rid of the strangers in his mind. A phrase which actually comes from a poem by Wordsworth, and it goes, "A strange is in my mind, a feeling that I was not for that hour, not for that place." Mevlüt knows full well that the shimmering windows, which he admires, hide the illicit gains of those who finance them. The women in his extended family spend their lives providing essential services to the wealthy, such as house cleaning, child care, or elder care, but they are never allowed to pass the threshold and become fully integrated into these families or their lives. They are accepted mostly as workers who remain on the margins. It is not surprising that when Mevlüt grows old and is not able to spend as much time walking on the streets, he focuses energies on volunteering and supporting his hometown association. The networks that welcomed Mevlüt and his father helped them with their early dwellings, found them their first jobs, and gave Mevlüt his apartment, once again provides them with meaning and security. Mevlüt's success is his own personal accomplishment, and as such, it is precarious. It takes place amidst an environment that offers no protection or safety to people like him. Especially under the circumstances of the fast economic transformation which Turkey experienced in the 20th century, these conditions resemble what economic historians described as the satanic mills of the early industrial revolution. It is an environment that was rampant with long hours, unsafe working conditions, low wages, and child labor. In short, an environment that had no safeguards, rules, or protections. At one point, his cousin's wife reminds Mevlüt that, quote, rights don't matter in the city, only profits. One of the shortcomings of the Republican state has been its failure to develop the kind of institutions that would have provided guardrails to Turkey's development so that the well-being of people like Mevlüt was secured. The extent of the damage caused by the recent earthquake laid bare how weak the foundations of the Republican state were, and how much weaker they have become in the last 20 years. With their optimism and resourcefulness, Karpat's interviews and Pamuk's characters could have become the agents of a stronger national integration. This would have been possible only with the help of institutions and policies that could open their paths and provide them with safety and protection. In their absence, the migrants like Mevlüt find themselves having to fend for themselves and wage a lonely and alienating struggle, which takes a huge toll on them and on the society. Thank you. To people who helped me with the visuals, so I just want to acknowledge their help. But I think this is pleasant.
Thank you so much for that really thought-provoking talk, Professor Kasava. We have plenty of time for questions. I'm going to pass around the microphone. I see Nalan's hand.
Thank you, Professor, for this great talk. So my question begins with an observation. And so the historical beginning of the novel, Orhan Pamuk's novel, coincides with worker migration to also Germany, right? So 60s. And I think that if Professor Karpat wrote the book, maybe a decade later, he would have compared, right, migrants, the urban migration in Germany, especially in Berlin and bigger cities in Germany, to Istanbul. And perhaps connected to that, I feel like the internal migration in Turkey is more similar to or seen as an external migration by the people in Turkey, right? By the urban people in bigger cities. I mean, could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit?
I think this is I actually thought about that when I went back and reread the book several times, and it is absolutely true. It's more or less the same time period, and the similarities are interesting. And from what I know, it happens simultaneously, but you don't really have a situation of two-step migration. So mostly people who ended up going to Germany, they went straight from their provinces to Germany. or from this department to Istanbul. So in terms of their experience, it's very, very similar. And just like coming to Istanbul was coming to this, city, which symbols future modernity, etc. And that is also true. I mean, with Germany, it was unknown. But one of the things, I mean, recently I was covering this in one of my classes, and there's a famous photograph of first wave of people leaving Turkey on the train station. And I asked my students, what do you think this is, what do you see this that's kind of interesting? And they made some comments. But one thing that came out is they're so well dressed. I mean, you have people in suits and ties and jackets, and suitcases. They're going to Germany, to the West, to Europe. So there is, I think, in their minds, it's a similar kind of. So in a way, both the urban parts of Istanbul and also Europe and Germany become part of their universe. What are they thinking? How they think of themselves, what they can do. And that, of course, I mean, the numbers are such that that relationship with Europe also ended up really leaving a very big mark on Turkey's, history and everything like that. I think it's a very important part of this. I mean, the person who wrote about this more or less simultaneously, of course, is Nermin Abadan Onat. And she's actually, I think, just 101 now.
Oh, wow.
But very, very interesting. I mean, her writings are sorry.
There's a question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was curious, what was the reason for the closure of these people's houses in the 1950s? And also, was there migration to other urban areas in Turkey besides Istanbul? I was thinking of Ankara or provincial capitals. And then also, just as a quick comment, it's interesting to note that in Portugal, there were similar organizations that were set up in rural areas, also known as Houses of the People, and I think with similar purposes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So when you say closure, what do you mean by a closure? What are you referring to?
Well, you mentioned that the people's houses were
Oh,
closed
people's
down.
houses, yeah, people, I told people, the houses of people, people's houses, yeah.
Right.
So that was a political decision in 1950 when as a result of the first elections, Democrat Party came to power, and people's houses actually were part of the Republican People's Party's party organization. It was their vision, so it was a very political decision that they did away with those. The other question, the other cities, absolutely. I mean, one of the slides I showed actually is from Ankara. So when I say 80% urban, this is not just Istanbul, obviously.
Right.
The provincial centers, Ankara, Istanbul, Izmir, Adana, these are all cities that experience that kind of growth. Yeah.
Mhm.
But Istanbul is just so huge, it became so huge, so dominant. So it becomes, dominates everything else. But it's
Yeah, that was similar in the Portuguese case. It was the Salazar Party that
Yeah.
established these organizations.
yeah, and there is some, especially before World War II, there is some, awareness of some of these European practices that
Right.
the Republican People's Party copied.
Mhm.
Thank you so much. And question also going to be from the way that she started to speak. So you said when Mevlüt went to streets and started to sell his boza, he wasn't feeling that strangeness that much.
Yeah.
So he was kind of associating his belongingness to his labor.
Yeah.
So he had these two had a direct connection. But if a factory worker in Istanbul would go to a factory to work, they wouldn't feel in the same way, right? I was wondering whether there is any research on how these people who worked in the city and didn't lose their belonging to their labor, and people who worked in factories and lost that sense of their own labor. So how well those groups are integrated, and is there any differences in their integration to city life?
Yeah. It's an excellent question. It's a very different, of course, there is circumstances with factory workers. You are talking about those satanic mills, basically. It is, that's what it refers to. And that is really the most typical experience. I mean, what Orhan Pamuk does is it's a fiction. I mean, you can't really possibly raise a family by selling boza. I mean, that's really, no matter how much support you have. But I mean, what he's trying to, I think it's almost like this kind of description of the modern city from the perspective of this one person who comes from this background and how he sees and how he interprets. Gives one vantage point, but by no means it's typical or explains. And even in most cases, driving, dolmushes or selling food on the streets or whatever, those kinds of activities, they themselves have their own hierarchies and exploitation. And so it is not really, it would be rare for someone to even let alone feel but be autonomous and do this completely on their own. But I think the purpose in the novel is a novel is to kind of talk about this on the ground perception which he does. But that will be the real story. I mean, there is some work on those workshops that developed after 1980s, where women were working and those kinds of. There's some work on that, but that is really that is the typical real experience. I let you.
I think another hand.
Thank you so much, Professor. I just, when you're talking, I just thought about like the last 30 years of like growing districts in Istanbul, like Başakşehir, Beylikdüzü, like these districts. And I kind of sensed there's a difference of kind of like community links, networking. There, people are more kind of like demographically different, perhaps their occupations are different. How would you compare like this last 30 years and this like let's say AK Party era rising districts of like Beylikdüzü, Başakşehir, and maybe like Sultanbeyli in the Asian side? Why these people are more kind of like loose in terms of connections with like neighborhood connections compared to like the earlier Gecekondu mahalles and neighborhoods?
I mean, that's the building of those neighborhoods themselves, and I talked about these, construction became such an important part of Turkey's economic growth in the last 20, 30 years. And so these residences for former Gecekondular is one part of it. The other part is, of course, all the roads and the bridges and tunnels and all that. And the third are those settlements, gated community-like places. And they provide, a lot of course, opportunities to make a lot of money for companies who are involved in them, but that they also promise a new way of experiencing the city, especially with the new transportation networks that makes it relatively easier to get around. So a new way of, away from like the typical kind of conversation, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. You're away, you're kind of, clean and green and trees and etc. And then we'll build a new canal and you'll, have a new. So that's really selling a new kind of dream to what I would call maybe the second generation of not so much the migrants that I was talking about, but maybe the second generation of, you can describe them as sort of middle class of people who now want to have a new way of, and that is, so you're talking about people, the kind of networks that were so important in this early phase, that the support networks, don't have that kind of significance anymore. And in the Gecekondu, I mean, in the resettlement of Gecekondu dwellers, some of it was deliberate and some political implications, especially with Kurdish politics, etc. But I think in this case, it's precisely the purpose of these neighborhoods to get away and to be free and to experience a new kind of city. It just changes them.
Thank you, Professor Kasaba. You took us through the continuous failure of the state,
Yeah.
systemic failure of the state through the two publications. And in fact, it reminded me of this recent anecdote after the earthquake when they pull out a survivor woman after a couple of days. First thing she says, don't take me to a private hospital, I can't afford it. And maybe the social networks you also described through these books compensated at the minimum level for that systemic failure. In a way, we don't see homeless people in Turkey as much as you would in
Yeah.
other places, or you wouldn't see riots like in Argentina after the economy collapsed.
Yeah.
But that's a bare minimum.
Yeah.
With that, and my question to you, there's also this perception of strong state, loyalty to that state, and the unwillingness to question the state. So this dilemma,
Yeah.
what do you think? I mean,
Yeah.
can you elaborate more on that?
Yeah. So the first part, it is true that these networks that depend on, people's own relationships and own resourcefulness, that they make up for what's missing in the country as a whole. And that helps, and that has helped, and you're right, I mean, there's still that kind of support that prevents this really, blatant poverty that you see on the streets here. But one of the points I was trying to make is that that's a very precarious thing to depend on, because as these new neighborhoods that we were talking about, as they develop, as the whole city changes, they will become less and less operative, and that will mean that people will be left really to their own devices. So that has made up that gap. I mean, that is true, and part of the success of Turkey's transformation. And I don't mean to say that it was a complete failure, obviously, but part of the story is that. Now, but that has not led to a strong civil society in Turkey. And there are different ways of thinking about this. Specific organizations, specific activities, but also almost like, think about France, for example. If they don't like something, they just go on the streets, and they go on the streets for 2 months, whatever. Because they don't want to get retired when they're 64. They want to get retired when they're 62. So those don't happen, and part of it, I think, is the sense of strong state. Now, Kemal Karpat in the Gecekondu has this passage when he talks about the transition to multi-party democracy. He says, Devlet Baba, he says, became something now, not just something that's out there, that's to be feared and to be, followed, but something that you can manipulate, you can vote, you can change, so people have some entitlement, etc. But despite that, I think there is this perception of there is a limit to which you can resist. There is a limit to which you can kind of go out and do things, and then beyond that you don't do it. Gezi demonstrations in 2013 were really the closest that we got to spontaneous show of defiance in Turkey. And had the government at the time responded in a different way, that could have, I think, been the start of a new tradition, a new way of thinking of state-society relations in Turkey. But what happened is that the government fell back to the old ways and suppressing, controlling, and kind of asserting that they know the best. So, so that is, in a way, you're talking about the, success of a model in many ways. You look at all these numbers, and city, etc., and then you explain the success by things that are not immediately visible. So people's support, people's networks and all those solidarities. But then because of this inability to have a direct impact on the state itself, there's a sense of so precarious. I mean, right now, everybody's like waiting what will happen on May 14th. It can happen one thing or it can happen the other. So there is no, so that I think, when you look at it over 100 years, that is an interesting question in the German schools. I don't know if this answers, but
I want to encourage if the undergraduate students in the back have any questions, they're certainly welcome to ask them. Maybe while they think about that, I wanted to ask you, if I may, if you'd like to say anything more comparatively about how you see the Turkish experience of rural-urban migration differing, right, from the experience of other countries or regions, right, of which there are many, right, which experienced very rapid such migration in the 20th century. And in connection with that, if there's anything you think that's particularly important about the Ottoman history, right, of the society, which would account for those differences? Is it the Greek and Armenian, right, properties and kind of the availability of that legacy, which we should really focus on? Is it something more about the rural social structure that moved to the city? How would you kind of account for some of the differences of Turkey?
I think there's a comparison. There are a number of cases that are usually talked about in similar ways, and most, I think, the ones that come to mind, Brazil, for example, is very similar in terms of the development of shanty-type towns and gecekondu-like places, and also the project of modernization that was coming from the state and its clash. The crisis of this industrialization model and the coming of a more neoliberal kind of system. There are some interesting parallels. Brazil definitely, but you can also find, I think the Philippines is another one, to this rural-urban migration. So there are certainly a lot of cases. I mean, in the world at large, I think it was in 1980, early 80s, that the world at large sort of became predominantly urban for the first time in written history. So most people in the world they are living in. And this is only partly natural growth, but mostly as a result of this migration. So there's a lot that you can talk about. I mean, I think the whole international migration, so not only internal, but migration across borders, Germany is an early example, but that's also part of that same transformation. So the Ottoman background, I think, the Greek and Armenian properties are definitely one, but also the fact that the idea of private property on land in the Ottoman Empire remained somewhat limited. I mean, it was 1858 for the first time. There's this, kind of starting to think in those terms. But it remained the case that the state, the empire, the imperial household, etc., they had possession of most of the land. And in a way, the areas in Istanbul that the immigrants took over were like that. I mean, they were really state-owned, state properties or whatever, municipality sometimes. So that is a background. So it wasn't really occupying somebody's land as such. They were, but it was, so that gave it a sense of accessibility and availability. And I would say that is one of the other thing I want to say is the mobility in the Ottoman Empire was different, I said. It was more of a circulation. It was really part of the land system and labor system. But at the same time, that kind of mobility from, let's say, eastern parts of Anatolia to places like Izmir or Istanbul or Adana carved a path, and that actually continued to be active in the Republican period. So sometimes the mobility that you see today, the paths that they follow are very similar to the paths that they followed historically. And there are very good reasons for that. So there's another background.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm trying to think how to pose this question, but I'm sort of interested in how religion plays out in sort of the notions of rurality and urban and like the urban world. I come from Mexico. I'm interested in that, but how would you see, like, for example, you talk about this urban elite, like seeing, like, with this particular feelings to the rural population of fear, at the same time, like, sort of paternalism, fear, and a sort of anxiety towards how to modernize it. But how did that play, for example, in the Ottoman? Like, I could imagine, like, the notion of a lack of secularization could have played out. For example, in the Ottoman period, like, from a religious perspective, how rurality was seen, like, how there was this anxiety towards the rural population during this, like, Ottoman period, or they were like, oh, they're like God-following citizens, like we don't need to transform it into like these other kinds of people. And then you talk that this is the last thing during recently with Erdogan and like this new sort of elite that it's more conservative. How does that play out? Are they like an urban elite, but also very conservative in terms of Islam, and how do they see sort of also like rural populations that I would imagine like practice religion more traditional?
Good. I think, I mean, just try to go back to the Ottoman Empire, the recent period, how they see the rural people. Okay, so I mean, on a general level, the way I think about what happened in the last 20 years, and it goes back a little further than that, but especially in the last 20 years, I think the best way of thinking about it is the whole phenomenon of class becomes, once again, the best way of thinking about this. I mean, there's always this veneer of, religion and, all those nationality, ethnicity, etc. But the distinction now is no longer, because, I mean, there are really, most of the people are in the cities anyways. So there is no, and then there is no distance either, because of, this whole networks that develop. But the distinctions are huge. I mean, Cengiz Inşaat, that's one of 5 families that are very close to Erdogan, these construction magnates. One of them is Cengiz Inşaat. They come from Rize. Erdogan comes from Rize too, surprise. And apparently his net worth is something like $220 billion. Oh, this is a construction firm in Turkey, which is still at best a middle-income country. I mean, those are those wealths. So when you go to Istanbul and you see these Ferrari dealerships and things like that, people who go to those shops are really this new elite, the newly wealthy group. So they employ the housekeepers and all those things. So I think that's distinction now. But they use, not really looking down on rural areas, but they use the notion that, oh, we're one big family, we're all Muslims, etc., but the real relations are much more polarized underneath. So that's how I think about it. In the broader scheme of things, one thing that's very interesting is actually when you read the Gecekondu Karpat's book, he says one of the things he says that's happening, he says these new immigrants don't really think about religion that much anymore. So they're, surprisingly in a way, I think there is this assumption that these are people who will become secular eventually. They will become part of this modern society. It didn't happen that way, but I think now at least I see it more as this class distinction. So the Ottoman elite, how they thought about rural areas, rural peasants, I mean, so there are two layers there. I think one is, if you look at from the perspective of the imperial center and how they saw the domains, it's basically the basic distinction of society was between those who paid taxes and those who didn't pay taxes. And most of the people who paid taxes were the peasants, the subjects. So that is really that distinction in terms of the well-being of the empire. That was the main distinction, and they were definitely, their culture is much more. I mean, it's a refined culture that is, Persian and Arabic and Ottoman and all these literature. But this was a very this was a kind of culture that related to a very small portion of the society if you look at the numbers. So there was these vast sort of groups of people who were outside of this. But the thing, of course, is that because you did not really have institution of feudalism or private property, etc., even in their dispersed existence, what we call peasants were actually people who didn't own but possessed the land that they were working on. So they were kind of in this situation where semi-autonomous or semi-independent, they were not subject to a landlord. So there was that kind of difference between the European experience. And as long as they were able to do that and they paid their taxes, whatever, they didn't really, but they were separate, definitely they were separate. And it's a different world. I mean, really, those of you who do literature, maybe it's in Ottoman literature, there is really two bodies of writings. There is what people call people's literature, the folk or whatever. The language is very straightforward, very Anatolian, very straight, and then there is the refined central literature. It's very different. They can't really communicate with each other. So there is that, but somehow it was felt together. And the other thing is, religion in the Ottoman case, and that continued into the Republican case. Again, what you can call vernacular religion was much more Sufi-based and very closer to local practices of people than the more central, Sunni kind of orthodoxy that tended to dominate the imperial center. So,
Time for one.
undergraduates, I have a question from undergraduates.
If you can shout.
Yes.
When we talk about your talk and all the questions that we had today, especially the one that Batuman asked, can we talk about the Turkish national identity today? And if so, how could we define it?
Turkish national
Like
identity.
an identity that belongs to the Turks.
Right. Want to invite me for another lecture? my sense is, I mean, it's very hard really to define something like that from outside. I mean, to answer a question like that, I look at people's own expressions of how they define themselves and why, and how they demonstrate how they define themselves. So if it suits his purposes, we see President Erdogan talking about nationalism and Turkish national identity. But I think I see that as more like what a political leader does to advance his own political fortunes. But in practice, I see manifestations of a common experience that leads people do things together at crucial points in time. Like the response to this earthquake or something. And there's no other basis other than feeling that you are part of the large community, Turkish or whatever, that leads you to help people in that kind of situation, that propels you. So in important times in social movements or crucial times in history, people do things together for a common purpose. So that becomes, I think, assertion of a certain kind of national identity. But if you step outside from that, and if you try to kind of define something as Turkish identity at any point in Turkish history, it's just too complicated to either it becomes something so big and amorphous that it doesn't have any meaning, or you end up defining it in a way that it ends up excluding a lot of people. So I'm much more comfortable in looking at these things in their specific historical contexts, and really it's like if somebody says that they're Turkish, then I'm willing to accept that they're Turkish, and I can't tell them that you're not. And the same thing, like if somebody says that they're Kurdish, so that's, I can't say that there's, you can't be Kurdish, So that is, that's how I think about it.
Please join me in thanking our guests. And thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And do sign the sheet if you didn't have a chance already. Please, thank you.